He walked up to evict his ex-wife from the guest house, only to find his daughters living there by choice. What started as a simple confrontation turned into a custody battle that spiraled beyond control. But in the end, it wasn't the court that delivered the final blow, it was his own family. The wine shimmered ruby red inside the crystal glass as Martin Langston held it up to the light, swirling it slowly, the way sommeliers did in expensive restaurants. He didn't drink it, he merely admired it. The same way he admired everything he now surrounded himself with. Flawless, expensive, curated. The minimalist chandelier above the glass table reflected on the marble floor beneath his leather shoes, creating a faint echo of something timeless, powerful, and untouchable. He was the kind of man who'd never needed to question his place in the world. He made his fortune in real estate, flipped empires with the flick of a pen, and rebuilt cities the way some men rearranged furniture. Everything, down to the stitching of his Italian suit, whispered dominance. And yet, somewhere in the silence of his 14,000-square-foot estate, Martin couldn't shake the itch, like something imperfect had been buried under all that polish. Across the room, Brielle, a stunning blonde in her mid-20s with perfect skin and a smile sculpted for cameras, adjusted her necklace in the reflection of a gilded mirror. She had been quiet lately, more than usual. When they met, she had sparkled like the surface of a lake in sunlight, playful, mysterious, irresistible. That sparkle had dimmed somewhat, now replaced by a kind of tension Martin couldn't quite define. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the fact that he still hadn't followed through on his promise to launch her jewelry line. Maybe it was something else. "You're not even drinking the wine," she said without turning, her voice smooth but detached. "I'm admiring it," Martin replied, still watching the slow spin of red inside his glass. "Everything has a process, Brie." She rolled her eyes so faintly it could have passed unnoticed, but Martin caught it in the reflection. He ignored it, letting silence hang between them, thick with unsaid things. This wasn't the first time she'd hinted at dissatisfaction, and it wouldn't be the last. "I thought you had a meeting with the architect this morning," she said, applying a fresh coat of gloss, even though her lips already shone. "Postponed," he said. "Too much going on with the guest house." "Still trying to evict your ex?" she asked, glancing at him now. Martin's jaw tightened. "Not trying. I will." "Sure." She looked away again, that slight smirk forming at the edge of her lips, the kind that suggested she knew more than she let on. It irritated him, not because she was wrong, but because she wasn't entirely right either. Yes, he had given Sarah, the woman he'd been married to for 17 years, temporary use of the guest house during the divorce proceedings. Yes, he had promised it would only be for a few months. And yes, that was almost a year ago now. But things were complicated. The girls, his daughters, Ava and Morgan, had been sensitive about the split, and at the time, letting Sarah stay close seemed like the easiest way to manage the transition. Now, though, it was a loose thread on a finely tailored suit. "Unseemly, Brielle," he said, placing the glass on the table with a quiet clink. "Do you know what I had to go through to get that property built? That guest house wasn't meant to be permanent housing. It was meant for staff, gardeners, weekend guests. Not," he trailed off, "not ex-wives," she finished for him, smiling sweetly now. "I get it. But Martin," her voice softened as she walked toward him, placing a hand on his chest. "You told me this was our new beginning. You said we'd have this house, the future, maybe even kids. How can we do that when she's literally right there, 500 feet from the kitchen window?" Martin held her gaze. She was beautiful, almost painfully so. But sometimes, when she spoke like this, demanding, impatient, he couldn't help but compare her to Sarah. Sarah, who had never asked for more than he gave, who had carried their girls through flu seasons and summer camps, who had waited late nights with dinner still warm when he didn't show, who'd faded slowly into the background of his ambition like an old painting, forgotten but still hanging. "I'll take care of it," he said. "You've said that for months," Brielle replied, pulling away. "I think it's time." He didn't respond. Not because he didn't agree, but because he wasn't sure how to do it without unraveling more than he intended. The girls still visited him on weekends, still called him Dad with affection, though Ava, the oldest, had started using a clipped tone recently. He wondered if Sarah was saying something to them, poisoning the well. Or maybe they were just old enough to form their own opinions now. That was more dangerous. Later that afternoon, Martin sat in his study reviewing financial statements when he caught movement on one of the security monitors. Sarah was outside the guest house, arms crossed, speaking with someone he couldn't see on the camera angle. It was the kind of thing that shouldn't have mattered, yet something about it gnawed at him. The ease with which she stood there, as if she belonged, as if she wasn't clinging to what remained of a life she'd been rightfully dismissed from. He dialed his lawyer. "Alan, it's time. I want the paperwork drawn up. I want her out." "Martin," came the sigh on the other end, "we've been over this. The divorce agreement didn't put a hard limit on her stay. You said it yourself. You didn't want to trigger anything with the kids." "Well, now I do," Martin snapped. "She's gotten comfortable. It's time to remind her this isn't hers anymore." Alan paused. "You're sure?" "Yes." "Then I'll get the eviction paperwork started. But expect pushback." Martin didn't care. Or at least, he told himself he didn't. That evening, he stood on the balcony overlooking the guest house. Lights were on. Laughter, soft, feminine, floated up through the air. Two voices. The girls. His chest tightened. They weren't due to visit until the weekend. He stepped closer to the railing, peering down. Morgan, the younger one, was twirling in the grass while Ava sat on the porch steps, talking animatedly to her mother. They hadn't told him they'd gone over. No text, no call, nothing. Behind him, Brielle appeared, draping a silk robe loosely over her figure. "What is it?" she asked, joining him. He nodded toward the guest house. "They're down there. My daughters. Visiting their mom," she said with a hint of an edge. Can you blame them? That stung more than it should have. He didn't reply, but in that moment, a slow, unfamiliar feeling crept into his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't jealousy. It was something that looked suspiciously like fear. Down there, in the house he'd once called home, the life he left behind still existed, still laughed, still breathed without him. And for the first time since the ink dried on the divorce, Martin Langston wondered if maybe he'd underestimated what he'd lost. The wind shifted. The smell of jasmine from the garden drifted upward. The sound of Morgan's laughter rose with it, wild and unbothered. "You coming in?" Brielle asked, her voice thinner now, as if even she felt the distance growing between them. "In a minute," Martin muttered. And as the light faded from the sky, Martin stared at the glowing guest house, suddenly unsure of whose house, whose life, was the real one. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd go down there himself and get things sorted once and for all. But what he found would be nothing like what he expected. Hold up, if you were in Martin's shoes right now, what would you do? Let her stay? Fight for control? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let us know what you would have done. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and rate the story so far from 0 to 10. And hey, your support from supers in the comments helps keep this channel strong. Stick around, because things are just getting started. The morning sun filtered through the towering glass windows of Martin Langston's master bedroom, casting golden stripes over the linen sheets and the polished hardwood floors. The estate was waking up. Gardening tools clanked faintly outside. The espresso machine sputtered to life in the kitchen downstairs, and somewhere in the distance, sprinklers hissed to a rhythmic beat. Brielle had already left the bed, her silk robe trailing across the floor like smoke, and her perfume still lingered in the air, sweet and intentional. Martin lay still for a moment, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Today would be the day. No more delays, no more negotiations. He would walk down to the guest house and tell Sarah she had until the end of the week to move out. It was time. This chapter of his life was over, and he was ready to cut the last thread clean. He took his time showering, selecting a crisp shirt and slipping on his favorite pair of Italian loafers, polished to perfection. Power was about appearance as much as action. As he tightened the gold cufflinks at his wrists, he caught his own reflection in the mirror, sharp, ageless, decisive. This was the Martin Langston who closed million-dollar contracts with a single meeting. He wasn't going to let sentimentality or nostalgia derail him. Still, as he passed through the sunlit hallway, a strange stillness crept into his chest, something between nerves and dread. He shook it off. Outside, the morning air was thick with warmth, and the stone path leading to the guest house curved elegantly between rose bushes and manicured hedges. He walked slowly, each step calculated, rehearsing the speech he would deliver. Keep it professional, firm. Don't let her shift the tone. Don't let her bring up the past. This was business now. She had overstayed. This was his property. He had been more than generous. He reached the small front porch, hesitated, then knocked 3 times, sharp, deliberate. A beat passed, then another. Finally, the door creaked open, and Sarah appeared. She wore a soft blue sweater and jeans, her hair loosely tied back. Her face was calm, unreadable, but her eyes, those same eyes he used to look into across candlelit dinners and hospital waiting rooms, narrowed slightly at the sight of him. "Martin," she said, not surprised. "Wasn't expecting a visit." "We need to talk," he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "Mind if I come in?" Sarah stepped aside without a word. The interior of the guest house was warm, lived in. Sunlight streamed through open curtains, casting soft shadows over framed photos and stacks of books. It smelled faintly of lavender and something baking. He hadn't expected that. He didn't know she still baked. "I won't take up much of your time," he began, standing near the entryway, not quite sure if he should sit or not. "You've been here longer than we agreed. It's time we finalize your move out." Sarah turned to face him fully, arms folded across her chest. "You said I could stay through the school year. It's March." Martin hesitated. "I said a few months. That was 10 months ago." "Because the girls weren't ready," she said quietly. "And maybe you weren't either." He frowned, ignoring the implication. "They're more than ready now. They've adjusted." She said nothing, only stared at him with that calm, steady gaze that always made him feel like she saw him more than he wanted to show. Martin took a breath. "Look, Sarah, I don't want this to turn into a legal thing. I'm just asking you to respect the boundaries. You've had more than enough time to find a place." Her lips parted as if to respond, but before she could speak, a voice echoed from the back of the house. "Mom, are we out of peanut butter?" Martin blinked. It was Morgan's voice, the younger one. She wasn't supposed to be here. He turned toward the hallway just as Morgan stepped into view, holding an empty jar and looking puzzled, until she saw him. She froze. "Dad." Behind her, Ava emerged too, holding a notebook, eyebrows raised. She looked from her father to her mother and back again. "What's going on?" Martin's chest tightened. "What are you doing here?" "It's Tuesday." Morgan shrugged. "We live here now." It hit him like a slap, sudden, stinging. "You what?" Ava crossed her arms. "We moved in a week ago. We told Mom we didn't want to go back." His gaze darted between them. "And no one thought to tell me?" "I figured you'd notice eventually," Ava said, her voice cool. She looked so much like Sarah when she was angry, calm, composed, devastating. Martin turned back to Sarah. "You let them move in without telling me." "I didn't let them do anything. They made their own decision," she said. "They're old enough." "They're kids," he snapped. "They don't get to just decide where they live like it's a sleepover." Morgan's eyes welled, but she didn't cry. Ava moved closer to her sister, protective. "Don't yell at her," she said firmly. "And don't yell at us." Martin felt the ground shift under his feet. This was spiraling. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. "I'm not yelling," he said, voice shaking slightly. This is my house. You don't get to make these decisions without me." "But we did," Ava said. "And we're not going back." Silence filled the room. Thick, awkward, painful. Martin couldn't speak. Then Sarah, quiet for a long moment, finally said, "They're not choosing me to hurt you. They're choosing peace." Martin blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" She walked toward the kitchen, poured herself a cup of coffee. "They told me it's quieter here. No arguments. No pretending. They can be themselves." "They had all of that with me," he protested. Sarah's expression was sad. "They had rooms full of things. They didn't have you." That landed. Hard. Deeper than anything she'd said in months. He turned away from her, looking at the photo on the table, a candid shot of Morgan and Ava in pajamas, laughing, flour dusting their hair. Probably from one of those baking nights Sarah used to do. He never made time for those. He was always in meetings, closing deals, at functions with Brielle. "I need to think," he said stiffly, moving toward the door. "Take all the time you need," Sarah replied. "But we're not moving." He didn't answer. Outside, the sun was higher now, too bright. He walked back toward the main house in a daze. As he neared the gate, one of the groundskeepers greeted him. Martin didn't respond. Inside the mansion, Brielle was on the phone, laughing with someone. She hung up quickly as he entered. "Well?" she asked. "They're living there," he said flatly. "Who?" she asked, confused. "My daughters." She blinked, stunned. "Since when?" "Since last week, apparently." He walked past her into the study, loosened his collar, and stared out the window toward the guest house. It looked small from here, like a dollhouse. But inside, it was full of everything he had lost. "You have to do something," Brielle said, stepping into the room. "This is going to look bad. You can't have your ex-wife taking the kids and camping out in your own backyard. It makes you look weak." Martin turned toward her slowly. "This isn't about appearances." "Yes," she said sharply, "it is." He didn't reply. Later that night, as he scrolled through his phone in silence, a headline caught his eye on a local tabloid blog. "Millionaire real estate mogul's daughters choose ex-wife's guest house over glamorous mansion." His blood turned cold. The article had photos, blurry, probably taken by a drone, of the girls in the backyard, Sarah on the porch, smiling. Public image. He stared at the screen. Then he stood up and dialed his lawyer again. "Alan," he said, "we've got a situation." And just like that, the battle lines were drawn. Not just over property, but over blood, legacy, perception, and control. And Martin Langston wasn't used to losing. But this wasn't the kind of war he knew how to win. Not with power. Not with money. Not this time. Not with them. And certainly not with the world watching. The article wouldn't stop spreading. What began as a minor blog post snowballed into trending hashtags, morning talk show debates, and op-eds dissecting every corner of the Langston family drama. Within 48 hours, Martin's name was mentioned across more platforms than during the last 2 real estate expos combined. And none of it had to do with his success. No one was praising his recent luxury high-rise acquisition or his latest foundation donation. Instead, they were talking about the guest house, about his ex-wife, about his daughters, about a millionaire whose children had walked out of the mansion and into their mother's modest quarters, and what that said about the man who was supposed to be the center of it all. Martin sat at the edge of his sleek gray couch, the television muted, his phone buzzing non-stop with PR alerts, messages from colleagues, and increasingly frantic emails from his publicist, Kara. She had always been good at putting out fires. This wasn't a fire, though. It was a slow, smoldering burn that refused to go out. "This is a disaster," Kara's voice echoed through the speakerphone, her tone sharper than usual. "It's being framed like a modern fairy tale. Everyone loves a comeback story, especially when it involves a mother reclaiming her space and her children choosing love over luxury. You're the villain here, Martin. And Brielle? The press is chewing her alive." Martin rubbed his temples. "I don't care what they say about Brielle." "You should," Kara snapped. "Because this entire narrative isn't just hurting your personal image, it's bleeding into your business. Investors are pulling back. A few clients have called to postpone meetings. One firm even issued a statement supporting Sarah's right to remain on the property for the girl's sake. You're not just fighting your ex-wife anymore. You're fighting public perception." Martin stood, pacing the length of the room. The walls around him were lined with awards, glossy magazine covers, and framed architectural renderings of the buildings he had designed or acquired. For a moment, they felt like hollow trophies. "So what do you suggest?" "Start with optics. Visit the guest house with cameras. Hug your daughters. Make it look like this is a misunderstanding, not an eviction." "I'm not putting my daughters in a PR stunt," Martin replied, the irritation rising in his throat. Kara didn't back down. "Then maybe try being a father instead of a CEO for 5 minutes, and you wouldn't be in this mess." He ended the call without another word. Brielle appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, dressed in designer loungewear that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "She's right, you know. This looks awful." Martin turned to her, already exhausted. "Do you ever get tired of reminding me?" "I wouldn't need to if you did something about it," she replied. "You're always so obsessed with control. But now that it's slipping, you're just standing there." "Careful," he warned, voice low. "No," she said, stepping forward. "Let's just say what we're all thinking. You've built this empire, this perfect image, and now that your kids picked their mother over you, that image is cracking." Martin's jaw tensed, but he didn't respond. She wasn't entirely wrong, and that made it worse. That afternoon, he received an email from his assistant. Subject line: "Today's public mentions summary." Inside, a list of links, headlines ranging from ex-wife prevails in emotional Langston family rift to how one millionaire lost the one thing he couldn't buy back, his children. There was even a podcast episode titled "When Money Isn't Enough," the Martin Langston story. People were dissecting his life as if it were a soap opera. And worst of all, he had no control over the narrative. In the guest house, Sarah kept her phone on silent. She'd seen the articles, heard the whispers, but chose not to respond. Her only concern was shielding Ava and Morgan from the noise. She made sure their routine stayed intact. Homework at the kitchen table, movie nights with popcorn, quiet walks to the park when the cameras got too close. Occasionally, the girls asked why people cared so much, why their faces were on screens and strangers were taking pictures. Sarah answered with the truth. Because people like to watch stories unfold. But we're not their story. We're just us. Still, she knew that wasn't entirely true anymore. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the Langston estate, Ava sat on the porch steps, scrolling through her phone. She showed something to Morgan, who burst into laughter. Sarah peeked out the window and smiled faintly. She was doing her best to give them peace, even while the world treated their lives like entertainment. But peace was short-lived. The next morning, 2 reporters stationed themselves outside the guest house gate. One shouted questions as Sarah stepped outside to collect the mail. "Sarah, how does it feel to be the woman who brought down Martin Langston's legacy?" The other followed with a camera, snapping rapid shots. Sarah didn't answer. She turned calmly and went back inside. Martin saw the footage hours later. It had been uploaded online and was already making rounds. The captions were merciless. "Calm under fire. Sarah Langston keeps her cool as reporters swarm." Comments flooded the post, praising her grace and slamming him for allowing it to happen on his own property. One particularly biting remark read, "The millionaire lives in a mansion but has no home." That night, Martin stood alone in his study again. He poured a glass of whiskey, watching the ice swirl slowly before he took a sip. Somewhere upstairs, Brielle was on a call, her laughter hollow and distant. The house felt colder than usual. Not physically, just lifeless. He glanced at a photo on his desk, one from a vacation years ago. Sarah and the girls stood on a beach, hair tangled in wind, all smiles. He had taken the picture. Back then, he believed he was building a life. Now he wasn't sure what he had built at all. The following day, Brielle confronted him in the kitchen. "I've been invited to an influencer event in LA next week," she said, sipping green juice from a crystal glass. "And?" Martin asked, distracted. "I think I'll go. Alone." He looked at her then, really looked. The carefully applied makeup, the flawless skin, the empty eyes. "Is that your way of saying you're done?" She didn't blink. "It's my way of saying I'm tired of being second to a mess you won't clean up." He said nothing. She left the next morning. Martin didn't try to stop her. By week's end, his legal team had prepared new drafts for possible custody litigation. Not eviction papers, custody. Alan, his lawyer, had advised against it. "This could backfire," he warned. "If the girls speak up in court, and it gets ugly, it won't go the way you think." But Martin couldn't stomach the idea of losing them. Not officially, not in public, and certainly not to Sarah. "They're still my daughters," he said. "I have rights." "Rights, yes. But love can't be subpoenaed." Martin clenched his jaw, filed a petition. And just like that, the next phase of the bitter battle began. Not in headlines or in whispers, but in courtrooms and custody documents. He told himself it was about fairness, about order, about what was right. But deep down, even he wasn't sure if this was about winning or just not losing again. And as he stood before the mirror that night, his reflection blurred slightly in the low bathroom light. He caught a glimpse of something unfamiliar. It wasn't regret. Not yet. But it was close. A crack. A fracture. A splinter in the perfect surface of the man he used to be. The public image was broken. And soon, everyone would see the man behind it. The courtroom was colder than Martin expected, not just in temperature, but in mood. The kind of cold that settled into the bones. Pale marble floors, sharp fluorescent lights, the low murmur of legal clerks and shuffled papers. It was a far cry from the sleek boardrooms and five-star conference centers he was used to. Here, his tailored suit didn't make him powerful. His watch, his shoes, the imported briefcase, all meaningless in this room where the rules of power shifted. Here, truth, or at least the performance of it, held more weight than money. And he was about to learn how little control he had in this arena. Across the aisle, Sarah sat with a composed expression, her attorney whispering something in her ear. She nodded calmly, not even glancing in Martin's direction. She wore a navy blue dress, simple, dignified, and her hair was tied back neatly. She looked every bit the responsible mother the court would want to see. Beside her, Ava sat with her back straight, her eyes fixed forward. Morgan, though younger, mirrored her sister's posture, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. Neither looked at their father. Martin's attorney, Alan, leaned toward him. "This is the preliminary hearing. We're just presenting our side and requesting temporary custody arrangements. Be civil. Be measured. No emotion. Let me do the talking unless the judge addresses you directly." Martin gave a short nod, but the tension in his jaw spoke louder than words. He had spent the last decade building an image, powerful, competent, above the fray. Now he was about to publicly argue for control over the two people who no longer looked at him the same way they used to. It was unfamiliar territory, and it rattled him more than he admitted. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled tightly back and glasses that hung low on her nose. She sat with a kind of quiet authority that didn't need raising a voice to command the room. Martin didn't know what kind of judge she was, but he recognized instinctively that she wasn't someone easily impressed by bravado. As the proceedings began, Alan stood, his voice crisp and measured. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Martin Langston, is here today seeking a modification of the current informal arrangement. While the children currently reside with their mother in a guest house on Mr. Langston's property, this situation was never intended to be permanent. Mr. Langston believes that a more structured and stable custody agreement is in the best interest of the children." The judge raised a brow. "And by structured, you mean?" "Mr. Langston is requesting primary custody, with reasonable visitation rights granted to the mother." A soft murmur echoed in the courtroom. Sarah's attorney stood next. "Your Honor, while we understand Mr. Langston's concerns, we contend that the children are thriving in their current environment. They have chosen to live with their mother, not as an act of rebellion, but out of emotional necessity. We will present evidence that suggests their mental health, school performance, and overall well-being have improved since the move." The judge turned to Martin. "Mr. Langston, I'll hear from you directly. In your own words, why do you believe this arrangement should be changed?" Martin cleared his throat. "Because it's not sustainable. It was meant to be temporary, and now it's become a media circus. My daughters are being dragged into a public spectacle, and I believe the safest, most responsible course of action is to bring them home." The judge studied him. "And by home, you mean the main house?" "Yes." "With you?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, then turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Langston?" Sarah stood gracefully. "Your Honor, I never asked for any of this attention, but I also won't apologize for being a safe place for our daughters. Martin says they should come home, but they are home, with me. They feel safe. They feel seen. I'm not fighting to win. I'm trying to protect them." The judge leaned back in her chair. "Are the children present?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah's attorney confirmed. "They're both here and prepared to speak if needed." Martin's heart dropped. He hadn't expected that. He thought the court would keep it between the adults, at least at first. But now the decision wasn't just about legal arguments. It was about how well his daughters could express what he already feared. They didn't want to come back. Ava was called first. She walked to the front with the poise of someone older than her years. The judge offered a reassuring smile. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to, Ava," she said gently. Ava nodded. "I want to talk." The judge motioned for her to continue. Ava glanced at her father briefly. "We used to live in the big house. Everything looked perfect, but we never saw him. Not really. He was always working. When he was home, he was tired or distracted. And then Brielle moved in, and everything felt different. We didn't belong anymore." Martin shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ava continued, her voice steady. "When Mom moved into the guest house, it felt like she was the one holding everything together. So we went to her, and it just felt like home again. She listens. She's there. I'm not saying Dad doesn't care, but he's not really there, even when he is." The courtroom was silent. Morgan was called next, and though her voice trembled slightly, she echoed her sister's sentiment. "I like it with Mom. She makes pancakes on Saturdays and lets us paint the walls in the playroom. Dad has a lot of rules, and everything feels so big and cold. I feel small there." Martin lowered his eyes. By the time they finished, the judge had all the information she needed. She didn't issue a ruling that day, but she gave them a clear message. This court takes the best interests of children seriously. A temporary ruling will be issued within the week. I recommend both parties refrain from media engagement and work toward a cooperative solution. These are not trophies to be won. They are people, young ones, who deserve peace. Back in the hallway, Sarah gathered the girls quietly, wrapping an arm around each of them. Martin watched from a distance. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words formed. He had prepared for a fight. What he got instead was a reckoning. Alan approached him quietly. It could go either way, but the testimony didn't help. Martin clenched his fists. They're kids. They don't know what's best. Maybe not, Alan said, but they know how they feel. And courts care about that. Martin turned away, the noise of the hallway blurring around him. As he exited the courthouse into the blinding light of afternoon, flashes erupted from a few camera phones nearby. Someone shouted a question, but he didn't hear it. All he heard were the voices of his daughters echoing in his mind. I feel small there. We didn't belong anymore. Later that night, alone in the vast silence of the mansion, Martin scrolled through old photos on his phone. A picture of Ava holding Morgan's hand at a zoo. Sarah in the background, holding a juice box, smiling at something he couldn't remember. It felt like a different life, a different man. And for the first time, Martin wasn't sure if he'd ever get that man, or that life, back. But he wasn't done. Not yet. There were still moves to make. And Martin Langston had never walked away from a fight. He just had to remind the world, and himself, who he was, even if that meant tearing apart everything that used to matter. A week passed. The silence from the court was deafening, and yet it spoke louder than any verdict. Martin paced the halls of his estate like a caged animal, checking his phone more times than he'd admit, each time greeted with the same hollow screen. No ruling yet. No resolution. And worse, no calls from Ava or Morgan. Nothing. The stillness of the mansion, once a symbol of power and luxury, now echoed with absence. His footsteps didn't compete with laughter anymore. His meals were eaten alone. Even the staff had grown quieter, moving through the house like ghosts, sensing something had shifted in the air. Brielle hadn't returned from Los Angeles. She hadn't called either. Martin tried not to care. In truth, he barely noticed her absence until one of her dresses, half-zipped and forgotten, caught his eye draped over the back of a chair in the guest suite. He stared at it longer than he should have. Not because he missed her, but because it made him feel like everyone was leaving and no one was telling him why. Alan finally called on a Thursday morning. We're scheduled, he said. Full hearing. Monday. The judge wants testimony from both sides. It's moving faster than I expected. Martin didn't hesitate. Good. Let's finish this. That weekend, the estate was swarmed with quiet preparation. Martin's PR advisor returned with strategies. Soften your image. Don't challenge the girls directly. Highlight your support for their education. His legal team helped craft his statement. Controlled, sympathetic, fatherly. But under the surface, Martin felt something else entirely. He wasn't crafting a message. He was preparing for battle. On Monday, the courtroom was packed. News had leaked that the full custody hearing was taking place, and spectators crowded the hallway like theatergoers waiting for a tragedy to unfold. Inside, Martin sat beside Alan at the plaintiff's table, spine straight, eyes forward. Across from him, Sarah looked as calm as ever, but he knew her well enough to see the flicker of nerves beneath her poised exterior. Her hands stayed clasped tightly in her lap, her lips pressed in a near-invisible line. Ava and Morgan were present, but would not be asked to speak again. The judge had made that clear. They'd said enough. Now it was time for the adults. The first half of the hearing was procedural, outlining the existing arrangement, reviewing prior statements, presenting evidence of stable environments. But then came the testimonies, and with them, the unraveling of a story Martin believed he had long buried. Sarah was called first. She walked with composure to the stand and swore in. The opposing counsel, calm and respectful, began asking questions about her relationship with the children, her daily routines, their emotional well-being. She spoke clearly, recounting how she'd ensured homework was completed, how she packed lunches, how she kept therapy appointments when Morgan had experienced nightmares during the transition. She detailed weekends spent at the park, the slow rebuilding of trust, and how she'd never spoken ill of Martin in front of the girls, despite the temptation. Then came the more difficult questions. Mrs. Langston, the lawyer asked gently, was there a particular moment when you knew your daughters didn't want to return to the main house? Sarah hesitated, and then nodded. It was a Tuesday. Morgan had left her favorite book there, and I said we'd go back together to pick it up. She refused. She cried, said she didn't want to go inside unless her sister was with her, and even then, she was scared. That's when I realized it wasn't just discomfort. It was fear. Fear of being unheard. Fear of being invisible. Martin stiffened in his seat. He didn't look at anyone. The judge scribbled something. Then it was his turn. Martin rose slowly, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked to the stand. He'd stood in front of crowds before. Investors, politicians, CEOs. But this felt different. Smaller, more intimate, and infinitely more dangerous. The questions began. Mr. Langston, how would you describe your relationship with your daughters? He cleared his throat. Complicated, but loving. I work a lot, that's true, but I've always tried to provide the best for them. I've supported their schools, extracurriculars, therapy when needed. I've done what I can. And during the time they lived in the main house, how often did you engage with them? I saw them in the evenings when I could. On weekends, I tried to be involved. The lawyer didn't nod. Are you aware that Morgan once referred to your home as too big to find anybody in? Martin hesitated. I wasn't aware of that specific phrase. Or that Ava said, in therapy, that she felt like a guest in her own house after you moved Brielle in? Martin flinched. I wasn't told that. The courtroom felt quiet. Even the sound of someone shifting in their seat at the back seemed loud. Mr. Langston, the judge said at last, peering over her glasses. I want to hear from you. Not your team, not your lawyer. Why should these girls live with you? He looked at her, then at the girls sitting with Sarah. Ava avoided his gaze. Morgan clutched a stuffed toy tightly in her lap. He felt his voice stick in his throat. He could say the usual things. Stability, legacy, a better life. But they weren't listening to that anymore. That narrative had collapsed. I want them with me, he said finally, slowly. Because I miss them. Because I love them. Because I didn't know I was losing them until they were already gone. The room was still. I made mistakes, he added. I thought giving them a perfect life meant money and safety and structure. I thought showing up with gifts made up for not showing up with presents. But they don't need a millionaire. They need a father. I want to be one. Sarah's expression changed subtly. Something between disbelief and guarded surprise. Ava looked at him, just briefly. Morgan blinked. The judge nodded and called for a recess. Outside the courtroom, Martin stepped into the hallway alone, loosening his collar. Alan joined him minutes later. You went off script, he said. I know, but it wasn't bad. You sounded human for once. Martin gave a dry smile. Maybe that's what they needed. The final ruling was scheduled for later in the week. Until then, both parties were instructed to maintain their current arrangement. No moves, no visits without consent. That night, Martin returned to the mansion, the silence louder than ever. He stood in Ava's old room, untouched since she left. Her books were still on the shelf. A few drawings still hung on the wall. He sat on her bed and stared at a picture frame on the nightstand. Sarah holding both girls at the beach, hair windblown and smiles unforced. He wondered how it had all slipped so far from him. He'd thought control meant love. That success could earn affection. That structure equaled family. But in the end, none of that could compete with warmth, with patience, with presence. And now he didn't know what the judge would decide. He didn't know if he'd ever be dad again the way he used to be. In the guest house, the girls were quiet that night. Ava had heard his words. So had Morgan. They didn't talk about them, but something hung in the air. A soft confusion. A flicker of maybe. Sarah tucked them in gently. As she turned out the light, Ava spoke softly. Do you think he meant it? Sarah paused. I don't know, she said honestly. But I think he's starting to understand. And in the shadows of a courtroom battle, amid broken pride and public chaos, something had shifted. Not everything, but maybe something. And sometimes, that's where redemption begins. The day after the hearing, Martin awoke before the sun, his body still but his mind pacing in a constant loop. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for the light to shift through the heavy curtains as it did every morning. But it felt different today. The house felt heavier, emptier, like something had been removed without his noticing. Brielle's side of the bed was cold, the covers untouched. A quiet emptiness hung in the air, and Martin didn't need to check her room to know she wasn't there. She hadn't returned from Los Angeles. No call, no message, just silence. By 9 o'clock, he sat in the kitchen nursing a mug of black coffee that had long gone bitter. His phone vibrated across the countertop, A notification lighting up the screen. Publicity crisis update. Brielle Richards photographed at fashion gala with new male companion. He didn't open the link. He didn't need to. The name wasn't familiar, but the message was loud enough. The headlines had already pivoted. Not just a millionaire losing his daughters, but a millionaire losing everything. First his family, then his public image, now his glamorous young wife. Kara called seconds later. "Did you see it?" she asked, already exhausted. "I saw." She's not answering any media requests, but someone from her camp leaked it. She wants distance. She's drawing a line between herself and the custody case. She doesn't want to be seen as part of the problem anymore. Martin's hand tightened around the mug. She was never part of the solution either. She made you look detached, opportunistic. The public sees her as the symbol of your midlife unraveling. I didn't need her to fix that. Kara sighed. Right now, you need to make a decision. Double down and keep fighting, or step back and salvage what dignity you still have left. He ended the call without replying. Later that morning, he stood in Brielle's walk-in closet, where the scent of her perfume still lingered on the silk gowns she left behind. He wasn't sure if she'd return to pick them up or if she'd simply send someone. A stylist, an assistant, maybe not at all. Her abandonment didn't surprise him, but the timing cut deeper than he expected. She hadn't even waited for the court's final word. In the end, it had never really been about building a future. It was about proximity to power. And when the perception of that power started to slip, so did she. Still, as much as her absence stung, it wasn't her departure that preoccupied his thoughts. It was the way his daughters had looked at him in court. The way Morgan had clutched that stuffed animal like a shield. The way Ava had spoken with conviction. Not with hatred. He could have handled that. But with disappointment. As though the father she thought he was had vanished, leaving only this polished stranger behind. That night, he sat alone in his office, a single lamp illuminating his desk. He stared at a framed photo of his family from 5 years ago. Sarah had insisted on it. A casual day at the park, no suits, no makeup, just a blanket and some sandwiches in time. He remembered being irritated that day, distracted by a last-minute deal, taking calls between bites of food. But now, looking at the photo, he saw something he had missed then. Sarah's relaxed smile, Ava's arms wrapped around his neck, Morgan trying to hand him a dandelion, and his own face, stiff, distracted, barely present. He didn't look like a man enjoying his family. He looked like a man passing through them. The next morning, a package arrived at the mansion, addressed to Martin. Inside was a thick envelope with Brielle's handwriting. No note, just printed papers, divorce proceedings. The message, once again, was clear. No confrontation, no apologies, just another thread cut. He read the documents slowly, emotionlessly, then folded them back into the envelope and left it on the hall table. That afternoon, he visited his lawyer to sign the counter petitions. Alan didn't say much, just handed him a pen and pointed where to sign. Any word from the court? Martin asked when the papers were done. Not yet. Could be tomorrow. Could be next week. You'll know when I do. Martin nodded and stood to leave. Alan hesitated. Look, for what it's worth, you handled the hearing better than I thought. You showed something real. That's rare in your position. Martin smirked bitterly. Too little, too late? Alan shrugged. Depends on who's watching. Martin drove home with the windows down, the spring wind whipping through the car like a current of everything he couldn't control. When he reached the gates of the estate, he paused. For a long moment, he stared not at the main house, but at the smaller one tucked into the property's southern edge. The guest house. Lights were on. He could see shadows moving inside. Sarah at the sink, Morgan passing behind her, Ava seated at the table, head bent over what looked like a book. They looked peaceful, untouched by the noise he carried. He thought about calling, walking in, asking to talk, but he didn't. Instead, he sat in the driveway watching them from a distance like a man peering through the glass of a world he used to belong to. Then he backed out and drove around the block. Again and again. Inside the guest house, Sarah felt it. That lingering tension in the air. The way headlights swept across the window more than once. She looked out and saw nothing. But she knew. Some part of her always knew when Martin was near. When the weight of his decisions hung heavy around them. That night, Ava stood in the kitchen, flipping through a textbook. Is he going to keep fighting? She asked softly. Sarah dried a plate and paused. I don't know. I heard he and Brielle split up. Sarah's eyes softened. That doesn't surprise me. Ava looked up. It just feels like everything is falling apart for him. Sarah set the plate down. Sometimes things have to fall apart before we see what really matters. Ava nodded but said nothing else. The next morning, Martin called Alan again. What happens if I withdraw the custody petition? Alan was silent. Are you serious? Martin ran a hand down his face. Hypothetically, it would end the battle. Sarah would retain custody, and you'd have visitation based on mutual agreement or a modified court schedule. And if I fought, you might win. But at what cost? Martin didn't answer. That evening, he walked the estate grounds until the sky darkened into twilight. He paused by the hedge wall separating the main house from the guest house. He stood there quietly, listening. Laughter floated through the air, Sarah's, maybe Morgan's. It didn't sound like a woman who'd been defeated. It sounded like a woman who'd reclaimed something. He turned and walked away. Inside the guest house, Sarah opened her phone and found a message from an unknown number. Just 5 words. I'm sorry I wasn't there. No name. No signature. But she knew. She looked at the message for a long time. Then she put the phone down and returned to the dinner table. And somewhere in the mansion behind her, Martin sat alone in the dark, the sound of that laughter still ringing in his ears, not as a threat, not as a loss, but as a truth. And it was the first truth he'd allowed himself to hear in a long, long time. Rain fell in thin, steady lines against the tall windows of the courthouse as people shuffled in, their umbrellas dripping and their coats damp. The atmosphere inside the waiting area was subdued, almost reverent, like something significant was about to unfold and no one quite knew how to brace for it. Martin sat stiffly in a wooden bench near the back of the room, hands clasped together, his posture rigid but not proud. If anything, he looked like a man waiting for a verdict on something far deeper than legal custody. A battle he had fought not only in court, but in silence, in pride, in the echoing spaces of his own home. He hadn't seen the girl since the hearing. Not a visit, not a message. He'd told himself it was strategy, that letting the dust settle might play to his favor. But the longer they stayed away, the harder it became to believe that lie. Alan leaned close, voice low. Judge Brantley has requested both parties present today. Final judgment will be delivered in person. Martin nodded slowly. And the girls? They're coming. Not to testify, just to be present. Martin's throat tightened. Sarah? She's already here. At that moment, the doors opened, and Sarah walked in with Ava and Morgan by her side. They were dressed simply. Ava in a gray cardigan and jeans, Morgan in a blue dress with little white stars. Both looked composed, though their expressions were cautious. They didn't glance at Martin, but he felt their presence like a gust of cold air. Sarah gave a polite nod in his direction. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't hostility. It was something quieter, harder to define. Perhaps it was just resolve. When the courtroom was ready, they were all led inside. The same judge sat behind the bench, her gavel untouched, her expression unreadable. Everyone took their places. The sound of the rain tapped softly against the tall windows behind her like a metronome ticking down to something irreversible. We are here to deliver a final ruling on the matter of custody between Martin Langston and Sarah Langston regarding their 2 minor children, Ava and Morgan. Judge Brantley began, her voice clear but not unkind. After hearing extensive testimony, reviewing documents, and considering the well-being of the children involved, I am ready to issue my decision. Martin's breath slowed. His fingers curled against the wooden armrest. In the interest of stability, emotional security, and continuity of care, the judge continued. This court awards primary physical custody to Sarah Langston. Legal custody will remain joint. Visitation terms will be structured and flexible, subject to mutual agreement or further court mediation if necessary. A subtle movement rippled through the room. An exhale from Sarah, a squeeze of Morgan's hand, a flicker of relief in Ava's shoulders. Martin felt nothing for a moment. Just the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the hollow sound of his own heart beating behind his ribs like a drum out of rhythm. He didn't move, didn't argue, didn't speak. The judge paused, then added something unexpected. Before we conclude, Ava Langston has submitted a written statement to be read into the record. With the court's permission, her mother will read it. Sarah seemed surprised but nodded. She stood slowly, unfolded a piece of lined paper from her handbag, and cleared her throat. Her voice shook just slightly as she began. "Dear Dad," she read. "I wanted to say this out loud in court because I didn't know how to say it to your face. I didn't know how to get your attention unless someone made you sit still and listen. I know you love us. I've always known that. But I don't think you know what that means. You see love like a gift you give when you have time, when it fits between meetings and flights. You think it's about making sure we have everything we need, but sometimes what we need isn't a car or a new room or a school trip. Sometimes what we need is a conversation that isn't rushed, a hug that isn't a goodbye, a moment where you're not looking at your phone." Sarah hesitated, her eyes wet, but she kept reading. "You always said you were building a better life for us. But a better life is one where we don't have to compete with your schedule, one where we don't feel like guests in your house. You used to tell us we were your world, but it felt like we were just orbiting around yours. I know you think Mom turned us against you. She didn't. She just showed us what it felt like to be heard." Martin swallowed hard. His vision blurred. Sarah continued, "I'm not angry at you. I just want you to see us. Really see us. Not as extensions of your legacy. Not as proof that you're a good father. Just as Ava and Morgan. We're still here. We still want you. But we don't want the mansion. We want the dad we used to wait for. I hope one day you'll come back to us. Not as the man everyone reads about, but as you." By the time Sarah finished, there wasn't a sound in the room. No shuffling papers. No coughs. Not even from the judge. Just stillness. Martin sat frozen, his entire body stiff, as if any movement might shatter him. For the first time in years, he felt something deeper than frustration, deeper than embarrassment, deeper than defeat. He felt grief. And it wasn't the loss of a ruling or a marriage or a public image. It was the loss of something sacred, something he hadn't protected when he had the chance. The judge's voice broke the silence at last. "This court is adjourned." The gavel struck once, but it might as well have been a bell toll. Outside the courtroom, Martin waited in the hallway, unsure what he was waiting for. Alan had already stepped away to make a few calls. The rest of the room slowly emptied. Sarah walked out with the girls beside her. She paused when she saw him standing there, unsure whether to approach. He looked at her, his voice gravel. "Did you know about the letter?" She nodded. "She asked me not to tell you." He looked down, then back up at her. It was honest. Sarah offered a faint smile. That's the one thing she never learned how to fake. There was a beat of silence between them. Then Ava stepped forward, standing between them. "I meant what I wrote," she said, her voice calm. "But I didn't write it to hurt you. I just wanted to tell the truth." Martin nodded. "You did." Morgan stepped beside her sister, looking up at him. "You can still come for pancakes. If you want." His chest tightened. He smiled. "A small, broken thing. I'd like that." Sarah touched the girls gently on the shoulders, and they began to walk away. Martin watched them go, their figures growing smaller as they moved down the hallway, wrapped in quiet strength. He didn't follow. Not this time. He knew now that he couldn't chase what he'd lost. But maybe, just maybe, he could build something new. Something slower. Something true. The rain still fell outside, but it didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like permission to start again. And as he stepped out into it without an umbrella, the drops soaking into his suit, Martin Langston didn't feel powerful. He felt human. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. The mansion had never been quiet like this before. Not in all the years Martin Langston had lived in it. There had been quiet moments, sure. Late-night hours filled with the low hum of air conditioning, mornings where the staff hadn't yet arrived. But this was a different kind of silence. The kind that settled in your chest and stayed there. The kind that filled the room with something heavier than sound. The kind that reminded him with every echoing footstep that the world he'd built was now missing the one thing he'd never valued enough while he had it. He stood at the edge of his home office, staring at a legal folder on the desk, unopened. It contained the final custody decree. He hadn't read it in detail. Alan had summarized it over the phone, and that had been enough. Sarah had full physical custody. He'd get visitation, supervised if Sarah requested. Ava and Morgan would remain in the guest house for the foreseeable future. There was no drama in the paperwork. Just facts, plainly stated. Cold and final. The media hadn't let up either. Kara had tried spinning the narrative. Martin Langston, the humbled father. Martin Langston, seeking redemption. But the public didn't care much for redemptions unless they were earned. And so far, he hadn't shown them anything worth cheering for. They liked the fall more than the climb. The headlines were still brutal. Langston loses it all. family, fortune, future? Ex-wife emerges as quiet hero. Daughters of the millionaire speak out. And worst of all, the endless comments on social media that painted him not as a villain, but something even more damning, a man who was irrelevant in the life of his children. Even his business had started to feel the weight. A few partnerships had gone silent. Investors hesitated. One board member hinted at a public image refresh involving Martin stepping back. He could feel the shift coming, a subtle but irreversible migration of influence away from him. He wasn't used to that. Not after decades of being the one who set the tone, dictated the pace, controlled the narrative. Now, he wasn't even sure what story he was in anymore. Then came the gala. It was an annual event, one he never missed. A benefit hosted by one of the city's most elite circles, featuring CEOs, celebrities, philanthropists. Normally, Martin would have arrived with Brielle on his arm, her gown glittering under the lights, photographers calling his name. But not this year. Brielle was in Milan, vacationing with the same male companion the tabloids had so gleefully plastered across every screen. He thought about skipping the event entirely, but Kara insisted it would be good for optics. "You don't need to charm anyone," she said. "Just show up. Be humble. Shake hands. Let them see you're still standing." And so he went. Alone. He wore his best tuxedo, took his usual car, walked the red carpet without stopping for interviews. Inside the ballroom, he nodded to a few familiar faces. Most smiled politely. Some didn't approach. He caught glimpses of whispered conversations, felt the shift in energy when he walked into a circle. There were no camera flashes, no excited introductions. Just the dull, lingering presence of a man whose crown had slipped. During the dinner, a journalist from a business magazine cornered him by the bar. "Mr. Langston," the woman said, recorder already in hand. "What do you say to critics who claim you've lost touch with your own family?" He blinked at her, the question so direct it felt like a slap. "I say they're right," he answered, voice low and even. "And I don't blame them." She paused, thrown off. "You admit it?" "I didn't see what mattered until it was gone. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't calculated. It just spilled out of him, raw and unscripted." The journalist raised her eyebrows and scribbled something quickly. She thanked him and walked away. Martin didn't watch her leave. He slipped out the side door shortly after, the sound of music muffled as it faded behind him. Outside, the air was crisp, and for once he felt like he could breathe. He got into his car and drove without thinking, the city lights blurring past his window. When he reached the gates of his estate, he didn't turn into the driveway. He drove past the main house, past the rows of manicured hedges, and finally, he stopped in front of the guest house. He didn't get out right away. He just sat there, engine off, watching the warm glow from the windows. It looked so different from the mansion. Smaller, sure, but more alive. Through the sheer curtain, he could see movement. Sarah placing dishes in the sink, Morgan picking up a backpack, Ava at the table reading something. They looked content, complete, and he wasn't a part of it. Still, he got out, walked up to the door, knocked once. The door opened slowly. Sarah stared at him, surprised but not unkind. "Martin, I won't stay," he said. I needed to see them." She hesitated. "They're getting ready for bed. I won't interrupt. Just a minute. Please." She nodded slowly, then turned. A moment later, Ava appeared in the doorway behind her. "Hey," she said cautiously. "Hey," he replied. Morgan peeked out next. "Did you bring pancakes?" she asked, half teasing. He smiled softly. "No, but maybe next time." Ava stepped outside, followed by her sister. They stood in front of him, waiting. "I read your letter again," he said to Ava. "I've read it a dozen times now." She looked away. "It wasn't meant to hurt you." "It didn't," he said, voice thick. "It woke me up." Sarah stood in the background, watching quietly. "I can't fix everything," Martin continued, "but I can start showing up. If you let me." There was a long pause. Then Morgan, without speaking, stepped forward and hugged him around the waist. Ava didn't move, but her eyes softened. "We'll see," she said. "It depends." "On what?" "On whether you show up when it's not convenient." He nodded. "Fair." Sarah opened the door wider. "It's late. They need rest." Martin nodded again. "Of course. Good night." He turned to leave, but just before he reached the driveway, Ava called out. "Dad." He turned. "Next weekend. There's a school fundraiser. Morgan's singing." He smiled. "I'll be there." And this time, he meant it. Back in the mansion, Martin sat in the dim light of his living room, his jacket draped over the arm of the couch, tie loosened. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like something was ending. He felt like something, fragile, imperfect, unpromised, was beginning. Not redemption, not victory, just a second chance. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. The mansion's silence had evolved. What once felt like a cold, polished void now pulsed with a strange sort of presence, like something was being rebuilt from within. Martin no longer roamed the house with the same commanding steps. He moved slower now, more aware of the weight his movements carried, of the echoes they left behind. The suit jacket stayed in the closet more often, replaced by open collars and rolled-up sleeves. The massive dining table, once a symbol of luxury, sat untouched most nights, while Martin found himself more often at the kitchen counter, eating takeout in silence, replaying conversations that had already happened and imagining the ones he hadn't had the courage to initiate yet. But the outside world didn't wait for healing. It smelled weakness the way sharks smell blood and water. 3 days after the final custody ruling, his name was once again on the front page, but not for the hearing. Not for Ava's letter. Not for his loss. It was the headline no one saw coming. Langston Corporation under fire. Financial misconduct allegations surface from former partner. The article detailed claims from a business associate Martin hadn't thought of in years, a former regional developer whose contracts were quietly dissolved 5 years ago. The man now claimed that Martin's team had falsified estimates on a multi-million-dollar downtown project, inflating values to mislead investors and manipulate city permits. There was no proof presented in the initial article, just a carefully leaked accusation, but it was enough to spark interest. Enough to raise eyebrows. Enough to bring back scrutiny at the worst possible time. Kara stormed into his office without knocking. "We have a problem." Martin didn't even look up from his desk. "I know. This isn't like the custody thing. This is business. This is federal territory. The SEC is sniffing around already." He ran a hand down his face. "It's nothing. That contract was clean." "Then you'd better find the documents to prove it," she snapped. "Because this man is not just talking to reporters. He's lawyered up. He wants a settlement, or a stage." Martin stood, walking to the window. "He's bluffing." Kara crossed her arms. "That might be true, but bluffing works if the public believes it. And right now, you're not exactly the hero in anyone's narrative." Martin turned slowly. "You think I should pay him? I think you should figure out what's real before this becomes something you can't contain. Perception is reality, Martin, and yours is already hanging by a thread." He didn't respond. By afternoon, the call started. First from board members, then from clients, then from media outlets who had ignored him during his custody saga, but now found him interesting again. Not as a father, not as a man, but as a crumbling empire. Kara managed the interviews, spinning what she could. "These are old allegations," she told them. "Retaliation from a disgruntled ex-partner. Baseless, desperate." But she knew how quickly baseless could become believable when people were already primed to see a man fall. Martin spent the next 2 days buried in documents. His legal team combed through contracts, emails, audit trails. There were inconsistencies, not of fraud, but of negligence. The kind of sloppiness that happens when a man at the top stops checking what's being signed in his name. He hadn't known, but that didn't make him innocent. At night, he sat alone in his study, the television off, the city lights flickering through the window like judgment. He thought about Sarah, about how calm she'd been through the entire custody battle, never once lowering herself to public retaliation. About how, even when she had every reason to break him, she didn't. She just stood there with her daughters and told the truth. And it had been enough. He wondered if truth could save him now. On the 4th day, the school fundraiser took place in the community gymnasium, a modest, outdated building that smelled like waxed floors and childhood memories. Martin arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a simple navy pullover and khakis, carrying a tray of chocolate chip cookies he'd bought from a bakery on the way. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. Just show up. Inside, rows of folding chairs were filled with parents chatting over paper coffee cups. Kids darted between tables, some in costume, some carrying signs. He scanned the room and spotted Morgan near the front, dressed in a red scarf and oversized sunglasses, clearly ready for her solo. Sarah stood nearby, talking with a teacher. Ava saw him first and offered a small wave. Not big, but enough. He made his way over slowly. Sarah looked up as he approached. "You made it," she said. "I said I would." Morgan noticed him and ran up, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You're not late." He smiled. "I wouldn't miss this for anything." For the next hour, he sat between Sarah and Ava, watching the fundraiser unfold. Skits, music, awkward jokes, proud parents clapping louder than necessary. And then Morgan stepped forward with a microphone, her little voice introducing the next act. She sang a simple song, one about finding your way back home, and Martin felt something shift in his chest. Not guilt, not regret, just clarity. He had missed so much. And yet, here he was, witnessing a moment he didn't deserve, but was still being offered. After the show, as families milled about, Sarah turned to him. "You know," she said, "they noticed you didn't check your phone once tonight." He laughed softly. "I turned it off." She raised an eyebrow. "Damage control," he said, "but not the kind you think." She didn't press further. Later that night, back at the mansion, Kara sent him a message. "We've got a window. If you want to speak, now's the time. The networks will listen, but only if it's real." He stared at the message for a long time before replying. "I'll do it, but on my terms." The following morning, he sat in front of a single camera in his home office. No script, no teleprompter. Just him, speaking directly. "My name is Martin Langston," he began. "And for the past few months, I've been at the center of a very public unraveling. I lost my marriage, my daughter's trust, and now, my company faces questions I never thought I'd have to answer. I can't promise I've always done things right, but I can promise I'm no longer hiding behind the image. I'm not a brand. I'm a father. I'm a man who made mistakes. And I'm trying, every day, to be better than the version of me that got us here. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for the first time in years, honesty felt like a strategy worth choosing. By the end of the week, the worst of the media storm had begun to settle. The former partner who'd made the allegations withdrew the complaint under the threat of a defamation countersuit. The Financial Review found discrepancies, but no malicious intent. Kara told him quietly, "You got lucky." Martin didn't feel lucky. He felt different, changed. And somewhere deep down, he hoped his daughters would see that too. Not through headlines, but through the little things. Through the moments he showed up and stayed. A month had passed since the courtroom echoed with Ava's words, since the fundraiser night where Morgan sang a melody that clung to Martin's soul like a second heartbeat. And yet, even as the world outside spun forward with its deadlines and contracts and carefully timed media statements, Martin found himself slowing down. For the first time in years, time wasn't just a currency to be spent. It was something he noticed, something he respected. Mornings came differently now. No longer filled with frantic phone calls or urgent meetings, but with quiet walks through the garden, a cup of coffee held in both hands, eyes fixed on the guest house in the distance. Not as a symbol of what had been taken from him, but of what remained. The business had stabilized. His public statement, raw and unfiltered, had shifted the tone. Investors appreciated the transparency. One board member even congratulated him, saying, "It's the most human you've ever sounded." Kara had warned him the damage might take a year to fully repair, but that didn't bother him. He wasn't chasing optics anymore. He was learning to chase meaning. And meaning, he had discovered, wasn't fast. The divorce with Brielle was finalized quietly. No press release. No lawyers sparring in public. Just 2 signatures, 2 initials, and the end of a chapter that had never truly begun. She had taken what she wanted, some jewelry, a luxury car, a few connections, and left behind little more than silence. Martin didn't miss her. He missed the version of himself who believed she was the answer to something deeper. That version, thankfully, had been left behind too. Now, the days were measured differently. In dinners attended. In texts replied to. In the way Morgan lit up when he remembered her teacher's name, or when Ava rolled her eyes but didn't walk away. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Then came the letter. It arrived by certified mail, though it could have easily been hand-delivered. A final statement from the court, formalizing everything. The custody arrangement was now official. Sarah had full physical custody. Martin's visitation rights were defined, clear, and, to his surprise, flexible upon mutual agreement. The judge had included a personal note, typed but signed in ink. Progress, when genuine, often earns grace. Let your actions speak now. He folded the letter carefully, and placed it in the drawer beside his desk without a word. That evening, he drove to the guest house without calling ahead. The girls had grown used to his visits by now, though he still never assumed. He always knocked, always waited. Respect wasn't something he demanded anymore. It was something he showed. Sarah opened the door. She looked tired, the kind of tired only parenting brings, but there was warmth in her eyes. "They're in the back," she said. He nodded. "Mind if I join? They'd like that." He stepped in and heard Morgan's voice first. She was laughing, big, full, unself-conscious. Then Ava appeared in the hallway with a worn book in her hand and raised an eyebrow. "Did you bring the markers?" "I brought 3 packs," he replied. "And poster board." She gave the smallest of smiles and turned without comment. For Ava, that was as good as a hug. They spent the next 2 hours making signs for a school project. Morgan was in charge of glitter. Ava directed layout. Martin cut and glued. Sarah watched from the doorway, arms crossed loosely, sipping tea, not interrupting. At one point, Morgan crawled into Martin's lap with a yawn. "Can you stay for bedtime?" He paused, glancing at Sarah. "If you want," she said softly. "I'd like that," he answered. Later, after stories were read and lights dimmed, Martin sat in the kitchen with Sarah, the dishes still on the table, the quiet between them comfortable now. Not the silence of resentment or awkwardness, but of 2 people who had shared too much life to need constant words. "You're different," she said finally. He looked up. "I hope so. You're slower." "Yeah," he said. "I think I was running from something for a long time." She sipped her tea. "What were you running from?" He thought about it, then answered truthfully. "The fear that I wasn't enough." Sarah didn't reply right away. Then she set down her mug and looked at him, her voice steady. "You were always enough. You just didn't believe it." Martin nodded, eyes stinging more than he expected. He looked around the kitchen, the kids' drawings on the fridge, the chipped mug beside the sink, the clock ticking with stubborn consistency. "I don't know what comes next," he said. Sarah smiled faintly. "That's the best part." The next morning, Martin returned to the mansion and did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He entered the garage, opened the storage closet, and pulled out the old photo albums. Not the digital ones curated for public view. The real ones. Paper pages. Plastic sleeves. Inside, he found memories he had nearly erased. Birthday parties in backyards. Beach trips where the girls built castles, and Sarah wore sunglasses too big for her face. Rainy days where they all stayed inside with board games and hot cocoa. He sat on the floor and flipped through each one slowly. In the background, his phone vibrated. A text from Ava. "Morgan says you forgot your tie at our place. She made it a new collar for the cat." He smiled. Then another message followed. "We're making pancakes Sunday morning. You in?" He stared at it for a long time, then typed, "I'll bring the syrup." And this time, there was no hesitation, no fear, just gratitude. Because the verdict wasn't just the court's. It was his daughters, and they had given him a second chance, one visit at a time. The penthouse was the newest addition to Martin Langston's real estate portfolio, a luxury glass fortress perched high above the city skyline. He had purchased it during the peak of his expansion phase, when everything he touched turned to profit, when every headline bore his name with admiration or envy. It was meant to be a statement, a place to entertain clients, impress investors, host the kind of soirees that whispered power without ever having to say it aloud. But now, stripped of the illusion, it stood hollow, another monument to a life that no longer fit the man who had built it. He stood at the window in the master suite, the city sprawled beneath him like a map of things that used to matter. The soft hum of distant traffic rose up faintly, but up here, even the sounds of the world seemed smaller. He hadn't stayed in the penthouse since the custody battle ended. The space was too curated, too sterile. He'd lived his entire adult life among polished surfaces and invisible staff. But now, the lack of warmth was impossible to ignore. There were no traces of family here, no fingerprints on the glass, no forgotten socks under furniture, no crayon marks hiding on the wall behind a dresser. Just silence. Just space. Martin walked barefoot across the chilled marble floor, each step echoing with a hollowness that made him uneasy. He passed the kitchen, where untouched bottles of imported wine stood proudly above a state-of-the-art espresso machine no one had used in weeks. The fridge, full of neatly stacked gourmet snacks and sparkling water, felt more like a display than something meant for living. He reached the sitting area, where two leather couches faced a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass. Outside, the world kept moving. Inside, time had stopped. He sat slowly, body tired not from exertion, but from something heavier, reflection, maybe, or regret. He rested his hands on his knees and stared at the skyline. At this hour, Sarah would be making dinner with the girls. Morgan would be setting the table with mismatched plates. Ava would be scrolling on her phone, pretending not to be waiting for him to show up like he said he would. And he would show up. He always did now. But tonight, he hadn't gone. Not because he was avoiding them. He never wanted to go back to that version of himself, but because he needed to sit with everything he had become. Alone. To face the reality of what it meant to be a man whose life had been peeled back layer by layer until all that was left was truth. He picked up his phone and scrolled aimlessly through photos. One caught his eye. A picture from 5 years ago. Him holding Morgan on his shoulders, both laughing, her arms stretched out like airplane wings. Sarah had taken that photo. He remembered that day. They were at a fall festival outside the city. He had been on a work call for most of the morning, and Sarah had been patient, watching the girls alone while he paced back and forth near the corn maze, barking instructions to someone overseas. He'd almost missed the pony rides, almost missed the hot cider, almost missed that photo, but she'd called him over just in time, and he had lifted Morgan onto his shoulders with one arm while still clutching his phone in the other. The moment was real, but he hadn't fully been there. Not really. And now, looking at it, he couldn't remember what that call had even been about. But he remembered Morgan's laughter. And that mattered more. A knock at the door startled him. He stood, unsure who would come to the penthouse unannounced. He opened the door slowly to find his assistant, Julia, holding a small box and looking uncertain. "I didn't want to bother you," she said quickly. "But this came to the office. I thought you might want it right away." He took the box. "Thanks." She lingered. "You okay?" He nodded, then realized how hollow that gesture felt. Not always, but better. She gave a small, understanding smile and left without pressing further. He set the box on the kitchen counter and opened it. Inside was a wooden picture frame. Simple. Handmade. There was a sticky note on it in Morgan's handwriting. "Found this at the art fair. Thought it would look good in your house, even if it's too quiet." The photo inside was new, taken just a week earlier. Him and both girls, arms around each other, mid-laugh. Sarah had taken that one too. It had been one of those lazy Sunday mornings after pancakes. They had gone for a walk in the park, and someone had offered to snap the photo for them. It was spontaneous, unposed, imperfect, and it was beautiful. He held the frame in his hands for a long time before placing it gently on the coffee table. Then he turned and walked slowly through the penthouse. For the next hour, he made small changes. He unplugged the cold, untouched wine cooler, took down a piece of abstract art from the hallway, and replaced it with a canvas the girls had painted 2 years ago, colorful and chaotic and full of joy. He opened a drawer and pulled out a dusty blanket Sarah had knit years ago and placed it over the back of the couch. Little by little, he softened the edges. The next day, he invited the girls over. They arrived in the afternoon, backpacks slung over their shoulders, holding bubble teas and carrying the energy of 1,000 stories. Martin greeted them with a smile and a hug at the door. Morgan squealed at the blanket, leaping onto the couch and wrapping herself in it. Ava nodded approvingly at the new photo on the table. "Looks better already," she said. "I thought it needed a little color," he replied. Sarah joined them a few minutes later. She didn't ask questions, just watched the scene unfold with quiet amusement. They ordered pizza, sat on the floor, and played a board game Martin had dug out of storage. At one point, Ava rolled her eyes when she lost a round, but didn't retreat to her phone. Morgan fell asleep halfway through the movie they started. Sarah laid her down in the guest room. Martin walked her to the door afterward. "I like what you've done with the place," she said. "Still working on it." She looked at him, eyes gentle. "You're not the only one." He watched her leave, then stood in the doorway for a long time before returning inside. The penthouse wasn't silent anymore. It breathed. It lived. And as Martin turned off the lights, one by one, and stood once again at the window overlooking the city, he realized the skyline hadn't changed. He had. And sometimes, that was the only shift that mattered. The late spring air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long golden rays across the Langston estate. In the backyard, beyond the manicured hedges and sprawling lawns, The guest house glowed softly, lights spilling from its windows like warmth escaping into the evening. A soft breeze carried the sound of laughter through the garden, light, unrestrained, full of life. It drifted up the stone path toward the main house where Martin stood, his hands in his pockets, watching from a distance. It had been 6 months since the final court ruling, 6 months since he stood in that courtroom and heard the verdict that had changed everything, not just in legal terms, but in spirit. In that time, Martin had let go of the need to control every detail of the narrative. He had stepped back from daily operations of his company, passed leadership to a younger, more collaborative board, and kept only a mentoring role that allowed him to stay involved without being consumed. His mansion had become less of a stage and more of a quiet space to think, to breathe, to heal. But it was the guest house, the humble 2-bedroom cottage nestled at the back of the property, that had become the true center of life. It had always been there, originally intended for guests and occasional overflow. But in these months, it had become something sacred. It had become home. The girls lived there with Sarah full-time, and Martin visited often. Sometimes for dinners. Sometimes for school projects. Sometimes just to sit on the porch while Morgan practiced her violin and Ava read novels on the swing. The routine wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments. Missed cues. Days when Ava didn't say much or when Morgan was too tired to engage. But it was real. It was theirs. Tonight was special. Morgan had organized a small family night at the guest house. Her idea, planned with the intensity of a 5-star gala. She had made handmade invitations, insisted on dress codes, and even asked Martin to arrive precisely at 6:30. When he had smiled and asked, "Why so specific?" she answered seriously, "Because we're serving appetizers at 6:40, and I don't want the cheese to melt." That had made him laugh. He couldn't remember the last time something so small had made him feel that alive. At 6:30 sharp, Martin walked down the stone path, carrying a bouquet of daisies, Sarah's favorite, and a tin of Morgan's favorite chocolate chip cookies from the same bakery he now visited weekly. He wore a blazer and jeans, a compromise between formal and comfortable, and as he approached the door, it opened before he could knock. Ava stood there in a simple dress, barefoot, hair pulled into a loose braid. "You're on time," she said, as if surprised. "I live 30 yards away," he replied. "Hard to get lost." She smirked and stepped aside, letting him in. Inside, the space was warm and alive. Strings of lights had been hung across the ceiling. Paper lanterns glowed softly. The dining table, small and slightly worn, was set with mismatched plates and napkins folded into triangles. Morgan stood on a stool in the kitchen, placing olives onto tiny skewers with all the seriousness of a 5-star chef. Sarah moved easily through the space, pouring lemonade into glasses and offering soft instructions. Martin entered, placing the cookies on the counter and handing Sarah the daisies. She smiled, genuinely. "You remembered. Some things are hard to forget," he said. Dinner was simple but delicious, pasta with garlic bread, a salad full of color, and the cookies for dessert. They talked about school, about Ava's upcoming essay contest, about Morgan's plans for the summer. Sarah shared stories from her new role at a local nonprofit she had recently joined, helping mothers navigate family court. It was the first time Martin had seen her speak about her work with excitement in years. Her voice was steady, passionate. He watched her with admiration he no longer had to mask behind arrogance or distance. After dessert, Morgan pulled out a board game, insisting they play as teams, adults versus kids. They laughed, they argued over rules, they accused each other of cheating with exaggerated drama. And when the game ended in a tie, Morgan insisted it had to. They moved to the couch for a movie, one Morgan had picked, one Ava pretended not to enjoy but smiled through anyway. As the evening wore on and the credits rolled, Sarah gathered the dishes, and Martin offered to help. They stood together at the sink, shoulder to shoulder, the girls behind them whispering and giggling in the glow of the living room lamp. "You've changed," Sarah said quietly, not looking at him. "So have you," he replied. "I think we both had to," she added. He nodded. "I was so sure I was right. About everything. About how to live, how to love, how to succeed. But I wasn't even in the room most of the time." She turned toward him now, drying her hands. "You're here now." "I'm trying to be," he said. She looked into his eyes. "They see that." He swallowed. "Do you?" She smiled, and it wasn't guarded. "Yeah, I do." The girls came over then. Ava flopping onto the couch dramatically, Morgan resting her head on her mom's shoulder. Martin glanced at his watch. I should go? Let you all wind down. You don't have to, Ava said, not looking up from her phone. Martin blinked, stunned for a moment. I don't. She shrugged. You can crash on the couch if you want. We've got extra pillows. Sarah raised an eyebrow but didn't object. Morgan clapped her hands. Yes. Sleep over. He laughed. All right. I'm not saying no to that. They gathered blankets and arranged the living room like a campsite. Pillows on the floor, an old sleeping bag unrolled. Martin settled in, shoes off, tie loosened, watching the girls shuffle around him like old times. Sarah brought him a glass of water and a spare toothbrush still in the package. Later, as the house finally quieted and the girls were tucked in, Sarah sat on the armrest of the couch beside him. You really staying? I think I've been trying to get back here for a long time, he said. She nodded, and after a pause, she whispered, Good night, Martin. Good night, Sarah. She walked away, barefoot, her shadow slipping down the hallway. He leaned back, closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, the soft rustle of bedsheets down the hall, the comfort of a home not defined by square footage, but by love. And as he lay there, half covered in a blanket that didn't match the couch, surrounded by the gentle messiness of family, Martin Langston felt something he hadn't in years. Not power, not control, not triumph. Just peace. And in the glow of the guest house light, peace was more than enough.